And the region that he studies, he also gives it the name Zomia, and this is a map of what he calls Zomia, following others. And he says that he wants to look at the groups that were historically marginalized or not studied. He argues that the history that we have is the history of ruling elites and the history of ruling centers, the history of metropolitan centers. And if looking at the map, he recognizes that in this region, there is a steep difference between the valleys where you had the rice paddies or grain agriculture, and the mountainous and the hilly regions where many, many different groups lived, and they deliberately moved away from the city centers. Because in these city centers, which gave us the large empires, most people were slaves. So looking at the map, he says, in this region, the maps go from north to south. And as soon as you travel for a few miles, you're at a very different altitude. And this creates a discrepancy between two ways of life, two cultures, which is very, very strict and severe. Okay? If we look um, at the region which is highlighted, this is called the Eurasian Steppe, the Great Eurasian Steppe. It starts in Hungary, in the Hungarian steppe, Ukraine, and goes all the way to Manchuria. One difference between Zomia and this region is that the mountains, as you can see, go from east to west. So if you travel thousands of miles from east to west, you are still at the same altitude. So if you're a Mongolian tribe that travels and in a couple of months is in Hungary, it is still more or less the same geographic conditions, the same climate, and they can live there as if nothing happened, which is not the case in Zomia. And if you look at Europe, you realize that historically, there weren't any groups that were important militarily or politically that lived outside the major cities. So in Zomia, you have major cities, but you also have the hilly populations, and they live together in a contentious relationship. In Europe, ever since the Romans, the mountain dwellers, the forest dwellers were subdued. The Roman Empire could exterminate them the way it could not exterminate the desert dwellers, say in Syria or in Numidia. So in Europe, we have one center, which we may call the center of political power, and as a result, the center of political thinking, which is the city, the polis, which gives us the word politics. Zomia, there is a very strong dichotomy. There are two groups, cultural groups, political groups. One of them is marginalized, but it was always there. And the other one is central, and it is the one studied by historians. If you look at the steppe, you have major cities along the Silk Route, for example, and you have the nomads, Turks and Mongols. And after the 14th century, we have a synthesis which we call the Turco-Mongol synthesis. Fine? So we never had one center of political power and political thinking. There were always two centers. The cities were major centers of commerce, of trade, of industry, of high culture, but the cities were always at the mercy of nomadic tribes that came to rule over the cities. Nevertheless, the relationship between these nomadic tribes and the cities was not as dichotomous as the relationship between the cities and the tribes in Zomia. You see, there is a gradient. There are extreme nomads who live in the steppes or the deserts, and there are pastoralists who seasonally migrate from one place to another. There are subsistence farmers who live close to the city, and there is the city proper. Okay? Now, this does not only apply to the Eurasian steppe. If we add to the Eurasian steppe, for instance, the Iranian plateau, the Anatolian plateau, the Syrian desert, the Mesopotamian plain, and North Africa, we also witness similar conditions. If you look, this is a map of the arid zone, and there is a certain continuity in climatic conditions. It is made mostly of steppes and deserts, Bawadi wa Sahari. And when Tamerlane wanted to ask about geography of North Africa, it is easy to imagine that he could cross Syria, cross Sinai Desert, and go to North Africa and live there the way he would live in Central Asia or in Mongolia or in the Karakoram Desert, because this is more or less the same altitude and the same conditions. One difference between Zomia and this extended region is that in Zomia, travel is very difficult and transport is very hard. Whereas in this region, because you have horses, because the elevation difference is not as drastic, and you have camels, you could cross this region relatively very quickly. Okay? So this is why, for instance, if you look at the period before the rise of Islam, we had the Gokturk Khaganate in most of, it coincides with most of the Eurasian steppe. The Turk Khaganate was defeated by the Tangs, okay, around the time when Islam was moving out of Arabia into Syria, Iraq, and Iran. We don't take this usually into consideration when we look at the history of Islam. And the reason we don't take it into consideration because the Turks were defeated, soundly beaten by the Tang dynasty. You could start to think what would the world look like if the Turks did not go into a civil war and were defeated by the Tangs. It would have been very difficult for Islam to grow. You know, part of our providential history is to say that Islam grew up in a region which was isolated and protected from the influence of the Romans and the Persians, right? And when these empires weakened, Islam could spread. We should also incorporate the Turks. For Ibn Khaldun, the two most populated peoples, most populous peoples were the Turks and the Arabs. And then there is a lesser group, which is the Berber. And again, for him, the Turks and the Mongols are more or less the same. Okay? And if you looked at history, if you looked, say, at this extended region, he would see cities, which are trade centers and centers of high culture, and he would see nomadic groups. Unlike Europe, these cities could never disarm the countryside or the desert. Okay? So the cities could not develop into their own, say, republics or polities, their own political structures, because these cities were weak and they were dependent on the nomads for their trade to protect the caravans and on their armies, because they always provided the troops. This image is very important for several reasons. One reason is that some historians and some scholars would want to say that the world that Ibn Khaldun studied is the world of North Africa. And what he says does not apply beyond this world. So they want to reduce the importance of Ibn Khaldun to a specific period of time and a specific region. But this is mistaken, because what Ibn Khaldun says applies to this extended region. Okay, a region where nomadic tribes that are armed, they always carry their arms, that are very proficient with arms, they're very able on the horseback, and they are the ones that have the camel herds, and as a result could oversee transport of merchandise and long distance trade. And this is the region that Ibn Khaldun sees. Okay, this is the first point I want to make. And this has a lot of consequences, because unlike with Europe, our thinking does not revolve around the polis or the city. There is not one center for our political thinking. There are at least two loci, two centers that are in continuous mix and where there is a gradient of power. There is the power of the state and the court, but this does not reduce. This does not. Um, this is not the only kind of power available in the region. Okay. I will look at this in some more detail later on. This is the Timurid Empire. So as you can see, as an heir to the Mongol invasions, he occupied very much a huge part of the area that I was discussing. If we go to Ibn Khaldun's discussion of the people that inhabit this region, he has in mind two ideal types. Do you know the word ideal types? This is a Weberian notion from Max Weber. So Max
Yes,
Weber said,
yes, they know, they know.
okay, perfect.
No,
So
please, for some people, maybe they may not know. So please explain. It will be useful, I think.
So the ideal type is a construct. It's a concept. Okay, it's a conceptual construct that is not separate from empirical content. It has a lot of empirical content, but at the same time, it remains a construct. So when you talk about, say, madrasa, okay, we have thousands of madrasas historically, and they differ. They differ across time and they differ across place. But when I tell you madrasa, each one of you has a certain conception. My conception might be limited. Muhammad Ali's conception might be more elaborate. But if we take Muhammad Ali's conception, it's something that he knows from reading history books and from personal experience. And this is the same conception that he has. So if I ask Muhammad Ali, what is X? And he says X is a madrasa, it's because he's applying the ideal type to X. Okay? The two ideal types that Ibn Khaldun uses are al-Hadar wal-Badu. Al-Hadar wal-Badu. Al-Hadar are the ones who live in or near urban centers, and the Badu are the ones who dwell into the desert. Bada means appear in the distance. Okay. Now, I want to insist that we always remember that in this region there is a range. So there is not just one type of Badu and one type of Hadar. Okay. There are the Hadar there are the Badu. They are usually tribal. Some of them go very deep into the desert, and they are camel herders. They can afford to go deep into the desert because the camels can survive in the desert. And their own survival depends on the survival of their camels. These are what Ibn Khaldun calls al-Arab or al-A'rab. Okay? And for him, Arab is an adjective. It is not an ethnicity. He could rely on certain hadith. For example, I think it was the first caliph, Umar ibn Khattab, who questions someone saying, انقلبت على عقبيك تعربت. And تعربت, the man was already Arab, but تعربت means, تعرب بعد الهجرة means leaving the cities back to the desert. And there are several uses of this word as an adjective or as a verb, okay, that Ibn Khaldun uses. But for him, Al-Arab are the ones who are able to dwell deeper into the desert. But Ibn Khaldun also speaks about those who are similar to the Arab. He says, Al-Arabu wa man fi ma'nahum. And when he talks about Al-Arab wa man fi ma'nahum, he lists the Berber and the Turkoman and the Turks, okay? And he means by these people who live in the steppe or in the desert. But sometimes he uses the term Arab only to those who live very deep in the desert. And sometimes he calls these guys al-mutawahhishun. Al-mutawahhishuna fil qifar, or man tawahhasha fil dawahi. By tawahhush, he does not mean uncivilized. It does not mean savages, as in English. Actually, tawahhush in Arabic is the opposite of uns. Wahsha is being lonely, being separate, being deprived of the intimacy of human community. But Ibn Khaldun does not make a normative judgment the way like the Western record does. These are not savages in the sense that they are lesser ethically or in civilizational terms than city dwellers. To the contrary, Ibn Khaldun insists on their moral superiority. He says they are أقرب إلى الفطرة. They are better natured. And he talks about their fitra or their morality as قريب المعاناة. It could be easily refined. When he looks at them, he also sees that they have their own culture and their own traditions, which are rich, and which he always puts on a par with the culture of the city. In fact, Ibn Khaldun speaks about two types of Umran, al-Umran al-Badawi wal-Umran al-Khadari. Okay, we can translate Umran as culture. It is a much more difficult term to translate, but we can say culture for now. Okay, and again, if we remember that there is a gradient, we can also think that there are Badu who live closer to the city. They are not mutawahishun in the sense that they are very far away. Okay, now those mutawahishun or those Arab or those Badu, they are well armed, they are formidable fighters, and they are very proud. And they usually do the bidding of the state. And because they are prone to fighting between each other, if there is a strong central state, this strong central state, whether in Iran or in Iraq or Turkey or wherever in this region, it usually recruits these tribes. It usually enlists them in its battles. The ones who are further away, these are the ones that cannot be taxed. But if you live as a Badu closer to the Hadar, you can be taxed. And this is another important thing. For Ibn Khaldun, being taxed is something which is demeaning, and it takes away from the pride of these people. It saps their energy. So, for example, human beings like animals. If إذا زال توحشها, if they're no longer wild, they become something like in his expression كالنساء على ظهورها, like women on their back. They cannot defend themselves. If they pay taxes and if they are under the rule of the state, the central state, they become weak. This is what he calls mu'anat al-ahkam, if they have to suffer the laws of a strong central state. So the further away, the less taxes they pay, the less they are subdued or forced to conform to the laws of the state, the more formidable they are, the more powerful, the more proud. Okay, their problem is that they are very prone to fight between each other, so they are always weak. You can think of them as opposing asabiyat. Each one of them is a asabiyya, and these asabiyat cannot tolerate other asabiyas. Fine. What happens is that at some point, a leader emerges who is capable of forging all these different asabiyat into a asabiyya kubra, a grand asabiyya, a asabiyya jami'a. Now, this notion of asabiyya is very important for many reasons. To look at the question of this lecture again, what can we learn from Ibn Khaldun? One thing we learn is that asabiyya is primary, that collective action is not possible without asabiyya. No action كل ما يجتمع عليه الناس كل ما يحتاج إليه, if we wanted to act collectively, in the words of Ibn Khaldun, requires asabiyya. We cannot achieve anything which requires collective action without asabiyya. Asabiyya is something which is very natural and basic. It is our desire to identify with others. It is more primary than the construct, the conceptual construct which shapes Western thinking. The conceptual construct which shapes Western thinking is that of the individual. Okay? In the desert, you cannot live alone as an individual. You can only survive if you have a strong asabiyya, where you can know that your brother will defend you to death. Okay? And let me see. This is a football, these are football fans. Like any sport, people have a desire to identify with something. For some reason, you grow up cheering for a certain team. Okay? This desire to identify is followed by a desire to contend. We want to show that we are superior. Ibn Khaldun says غاية العصبية الملك. أن كل عصبية في غايتها desires الملك. Mulk is not simply to kingship or kingdom. Mulk is dominion, the desire to show that you are at the top. Now, this desire to identify then is followed by a desire to contend. We want to show that we are better than them. In Ibn Khaldun's psychology, these are the desire to identify and to contend is at the root of our psychology. And it is what makes collective action possible. Some scholars would say it is what makes politics possible. And this is true. But this doesn't mean that Asabiyya is in itself political. It could be anti-political. It could be destructive. Okay? Now what happens is that you start from this Asabiyya, these petty Asabiyyas, small Asabiyyas of the little tribes, they are often destructive. They are counterproductive. But if you transform Asabiyya into a Asabiyya Kubra, then you have something which is very productive. Often. This Asabiyya Kubra is ideological. Okay? Now, when Ibn Khaldun thought ideologically, there were two terms that he used. Al-Qaraba, kin, and religion. One thing that he says is that kinship is always artificial. If there is a strong family or clan, everybody wants to identify with it. You have clients who attach themselves to the clan. You have marriages which dilute the bloodline of the clan. So one thing that Ibn Khaldun repeats is that kinship is always artificial. It's never really genuine kinship. You have so many lineages, but these lineages cannot be authentic. It's very difficult. There is an authentic core, but kinship is something which is more or less ideological in the sense that it can be constructed. You create a myth of kinship. Okay? But the real... Yes. There's a question? Was there a question?
I think someone opened.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the real ideological force in Ibn Khaldun's world is religion. And he says, for example, when he talks about Al-Arab, remember what I said about the Arab, not necessarily the ethnicity. He could be talking about the Turks and describing them as Arab. He says they are very destructive. They are destructive of Umran. They are incapable of politics, al-mulk. But when there is religion, when there is sibgha diniyya, it unifies them. It creates a unity of purpose, a synergy of forces, and they become very strong and very united. Because he says, الصبغة الدينية تذهب بالتحاسد والتباغض وتوحد القلوب. Okay, there is no longer any envy or any hatred. This صبغة دينية irons all these differences out. And once we create عصبية كبرى, this عصبية كبرى, like the عصبية, the normal عصبية, it also seeks to rule. But it is capable of establishing large empires. So the rise of Islam is like that. There is a great عصبية that emerges when everyone acquires the صبغة الدينية. and people are united and they are willing to sacrifice themselves for a greater cause. They're not so keen about money or wealth or luxury. And then you have a great empire. And every now and then, when Islamic nations weaken, you need some kind of religious revival. And a new revivalist comes from the desert, and then unifies people again. He could see this trend throughout history. Okay. Now, what kind of state do they establish? Ibn Khaldun defines the state as al-waza, the restrainer. If you and I are in a public space, soon enough we will be fighting over resources because resources are limited. But if there is someone strong, he could put each one of us in his place. Makes sense? This is what the state does. It prevents us from aggression. It prevents us from acquiring what is not rightfully ours. This is, I had this slide for the ideological part. So a state is the restrainer, but it is an external restrainer. Religion is an internal restraint. And if you don't have a wazi' min dakhil, then you are bound to be an aggressor and you would need a wazi' min kharij. Otherwise, the social fabric will dissolve. Okay. Now, Ibn Khaldun does not think that human beings can live without a wazi'. There is the wazi', which this is a picture of a Seljuk emperor, and the Seljuks were very powerful, and they could impose their will on everyone and force everyone to obey their laws. But in a tribal setting among the Badu, the wazi' is more internal. Ibn Khaldun makes a distinction between al-mulk or at-taghallub and al-ri'asa. Among the Badu, there is ri'asa, which is based on respect. At-taghallub is based on domination. Of course, there's an ideal where you could unify the two, but Ibn Khaldun, in his historical experience, this is usually very rare. Okay, this is why it was always the case that if you're a Badu and you come under the rule of a wazi', an external wazi', this somehow makes you less of a man. This somehow makes you less worthy of the title of a man. Okay, the only law that is worthy of respect is the law that you take upon yourself, the law which emerges from within. Okay, so we have these two types of waza. But again, I have to insist that if you look at this region, you always have to see it in dynamic terms. You always have to see a certain gradient. So there is, let's say, any one of the dynasties that ruled in the region, say the Abbasids, the Umayyads, the Aghlabids, whatever. And then there are the minor tribes who are within their reach, who are taxed, who are recruited when the Aghlabids, Ghaliba, want to fight a war, etc. And then there are those who are farther away. Those who are farther away have the strongest asabiyya because of their tawahush. They're strong, they're self-reliant. Their self-reliance makes them better warriors and it makes them more proud and closer to the fitra, as Ibn Khaldun puts. But if a grand asabiyya kubra, emerges among them, because they are strong, they are capable of unifying many of these lesser tribes. This usually happens, if this happens at a time when the central state is becoming weak, then they can occupy it and make it their own or establish their own dynasty. This is the cycle that Ibn Khaldun talks about. Okay, I'm not sure I want to go into the cycle, but I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with it. Is this a right assumption that there is a cycle of rise and fall of dynasties?
I think that many of us know about that, but if you can describe it in one sentence
Okay.
quickly.
Well, um, there's no short way of talking about it, but let us say there is a first phase when these strong asabiyas emerge and they establish their own state. During this first phase, they still have the morality of the desert, so to speak. They are egalitarian. Their chief is first among equal. He has a ri'asa. He doesn't have a mulk. He is not so keen on wealth, so he does not tax everyone. So people like him. Okay. In the second phase, he wants to rule alone. It's usually a second or a third generation. In the second or the third generation, people are still proud. They still feel that they're part of these conquering elite who were very powerful and who stood in the face of the whole world and established their own dynasty. But their ruler wants to rule alone. He wants to put aside his lieutenants, his supporters. So he establishes his own army. He hires mercenaries. And this phase can take a long time. In the third phase, he rules alone. He reaps the fruits of ruling alone, uh, and uh, and the state is at the peak of its strength. The fourth generation people, or the fourth phase, there's some distance from that original generation, which was so proud and so powerful. But people still think that they are strong. You know, you have rulers who are this fat, but they have all the military symbols and insignia, and but they are conservatives. They are not that motivated to do great deeds, and the state starts to weaken. And then the final phase, it's the phase of more or less destruction. I could talk more about these phases because Ibn Khaldun does not simply talk about a cycle of rise and decline. Everybody did that. The brilliance of Ibn Khaldun is to analyze each phase and to say that there are social and cultural and demographic and economic features which attend each of these phases. So, for example, he looks at the trend of taxation in the first phase, and then the second phase, and then the third phase. He looks at the demography. For instance, as the state weakens in the fourth phase, we have plagues because the state cannot fight its own battles, so it has to pay mercenaries, and mercenaries drain the budget of the state. The state can no longer afford to attend to public works. Okay. And there is a shortage of food. There is a rise of diseases. People are insecure in what they own. They no longer think in terms of long-term projects, right? So he looks at all these factors, and this is his brilliance. His brilliance is not just to say that luxury leads to the end of kingship or the end of rule. His brilliance is to analyze all these aspects very thoroughly and very brilliant. Okay, we can talk about these in the questions and answers if you want. What I want to say is that this is the system that Ibn Khaldun establishes or constructs. It's a sketch. Okay, it's also I put in ideal typical terms because there are so many differences. He sometimes speaks about 4 generations. He speaks about abanin wa mubashirin lahu wa muqallidin wa hadim. But some states can survive more than 4 generations. So again, these are ideal types. But one thing to notice is that this cycle is inevitable. Asabiya is a natural force, and like all natural forces, it is dissipated once it is consummated. Ibn Khaldun quotes the poet Abu Sakhr al-Hudhali, عجبت لسعي الدهر بيني وبينها فلما سكن الدهر فلما انقضى ما بيننا سكن الدهر. Okay, so fate or fortune kept trying to keep us apart, but when we were finally consummated, fate stops all its efforts. It's over. If the aim غاية الملك إذا كانت الغاية الملك غاية العصبية الملك, if the aim or the end of عصبية is mulk. As soon as it arrives at its aim, it starts to weaken. It's like a certain fixed sum of energy. That is very, very difficult to maintain. There is a text unfortunately, the way my slides work, I cannot find it now, but there is a text, a very brilliant passage in Ibn Khaldun where he talks about the possibility of someone trying to avert disaster, someone trying to revive the state. And he says if this guy recognizes what's wrong, if he's capable of understanding everything that is wrong with the state, and he tries to reform things, he will fail. People will think of him as a majnoon, as a someone who's crazy, or as a religious innovator, and he will have to fear for his fate. When we get into the Q&A, I can look this passage up. It's very interesting to read, and it also shows us how he analyzes things. So Asabiya is a natural force, and Asabiya can be maintained or given a major boost ideologically, usually religion, but in today's terms, we can still use the concept and think of ideological forces other than religion, for example, nationalism. But religion remains very powerful. There's no doubt about it. This is a painting by an American painter of the fall of the Roman Empire. And I want to conclude with this slide and then open it up for your questions. This is another Tunisian banknote, but this is Khairuddin al-Tunsi. Khairuddin Tunsi, 1822, 1889, if you can see the dates below. He was an Ottoman governor in Tunisia. At one point, he became Sadr al-Azam, the prime minister, so to speak, in the Ottoman Empire. He was brilliant. And he wrote a famous book, أفضل المسالك. And he was a reformer in the 19th century. And he wanted to argue that there are certain things that we should learn from the Europeans. Not because they are Europeans and we are not, but because these things are good in themselves and we have parallels for them in our own tradition. One of for example, he talks about how the French enjoy certain rights and how the French in return thank this gift. He actually uses this very peculiar language, shukrun nama, which is, in our tradition, it's really peculiar. He says the French has this attitude. They are grateful for having these rights, and as a result, they are dutiful. They want to pay back. They are civic. They have this civic interest in their state. They are patriotic. They want to do things. They're not prone to corruption. Okay, we are very prone to corruption. He's arguing. But one of the central ideas that he learned from traveling to Europe and studying European thought is the idea of checks and balances. That there is a separation of powers. There is the legislative and the executive and the etc. And that each of these powers puts a check on the other power so that you avoid tyrannies or you avoid corruption. And the way he asks this question, like any reformer, he has to go back to his own tradition. He asks it in Khaldunian terms. He asks the question, Man yaza'ul waza? Who restrains the restraint? In the conditions that Ibn Khaldun lived under, it wasn't really possible to ask this question. There were certain givens. You have to accept that this cycle will go on and you cannot dream of long-term stability. These rulers are not foreign, but let's say a Turkic, like the Turks who rule Egypt when Ibn Khaldun was in Egypt, the Mamluks, they come from abroad. They are militarily capable, and they're happy to leave the people alone as long as the people pay their taxes and do what they require. Sultan Wara'iyya, Ibn Khaldun calls it, and Mulk Wara'iyya at another point, with a little bit of disdain, is somehow disappointed that in these large states, the people do not have the kind of energy to establish their own rules. But he's aware that under the conditions of the arid zone, this extended region that I described at the beginning, it is impossible to hope for something different. With the rise of gunpowder later on, it was possible for the cities to defend themselves and to disarm the countryside and to establish political systems that are more organic. Okay? But this happens after Ibn Khaldun. And to be fair to Ibn Khaldun, it's not that there wasn't a restrainer who restrains the restrainer. In his mind, there is always the religious elite. And the ruler will always want to appease the religious elite. There are shared interests. But whenever there is a rise of tyranny, people can rally around the religious figures, whether they are in the cities or in the desert, in the Badu or Hadar. Usually the Badu is always the place where a religious revolution is fomented, especially when the central state becomes corrupt. When the central state becomes corrupt and luxury vitiates the state, the people in the city start looking outside of the city being the seat of power, for this religious figurehead who preaches a return to origins and the religious purity. And in the desert, these tribes start to gather around the central asabiya, usually around a religious figurehead. And then there is a call for jihad, and they topple the state. Okay, so there are forces which keep the state in check, but they are not really political forces. There is a vivid community. When the Mamluks come, when let's say the Buyids come, and then after the Buyids you have the Seljuks, and after the Seljuks you have the Timurids and the Ottomans, etc. It's not like that everything changes. There is a layer, there is a bureaucratic elite which remains there. These new rulers, like Ibn Khaldun himself, Ibn Khaldun is an Andalusian aristocrat, and his family served the Hafsids. And before the Hafsids, they served the Muwahidun. And when the Hafsids were defeated by the Marinids, his family continued to serve the Marinids. So although there is a continuous influx of new rulers, there are at least two layers of stability. One of them is the religious elite, and the other is the bureaucratic elite. In many cases, these elites are one and the same. In many cases, the patricians, the rich families, are the families which provide the merchants and which provides the bureaucrats and which provides the religious scholars. This is very, very much unlike what happens in the West. And this means that our hopes are always pinned on this elite in the Muslim world. We do not have the kind of faith that the Europeans have in the central state. Okay? If you look at Richard Bullitt's book on Nishapur, he shows you how the commercial, religious, and bureaucratic elite are merged together. And this is the kind of elite which has the prestige and has the power to restrain the rulers because the ruler needs them. And this is the kind of elite that normal people, when they have certain grievances, go to. But to be fair to Ibn Khaldun, I have to say that. But at the same time, the possibility of thinking in terms of checks and balances was not possible. This became possible when you had a central state, when you had one locus for political power. And this is the question that Khairuddin sets to answer. And he does it brilliantly. He looks at sources in our tradition and he tries to harmonize them with the kind of thinking he finds in Europe. How successful he was is a different story, but this is an example of how someone can go back to Ibn Khaldun and ask more contemporary questions.